The fog of post-war London clung to the brickwork of Notting Hill like a heavy shroud. In the 1940s and early 1950s, this district was not the affluent, vibrant neighborhood it is today. It was a place of transient populations, crumbling Victorian terraces, and pervasive economic hardship. The Second World War had left deep scars on the city, both structurally and psychologically. Rationing was still in full effect, housing was desperately scarce, and communities were fractured. It was within this environment of recovery and vulnerability that a quiet, seemingly respectable man named John Reginald Christie carved out a domain of absolute control. The address was 10 Rillington Place, a cramped, damp, and unassuming terraced house that would eventually become synonymous with one of the most profound failures of the British justice system and one of the most methodical forensic investigations in the history of the United Kingdom. To understand how a series of horrific crimes remained hidden behind a veneer of mundane domesticity, one must first examine the architect of these events. John Christie did not fit the stereotypical profile of a dangerous predator. He was mild-mannered, balding, and spoke in a soft, raspy whisper. He claimed this vocal impairment was the result of a mustard gas attack during his service in the First World War, a claim that garnered him immediate sympathy and respect from his peers. In reality, medical records later suggested his vocal issues were largely psychological, a manifestation of his deep-seated need for attention and his manipulative nature. This fabricated war wound was the first layer of a carefully constructed mask of respectability. Despite a youthful criminal record involving theft and assault, Christie managed to reinvent himself during the Second World War. When the conflict erupted, the desperate need for manpower allowed him to join the War Reserve Police. He was stationed at the Harrow Road Police Station, donning a uniform that granted him an aura of unassailable authority. To the residents of Notting Hill, he was an officer of the law, a pillar of the community, who enforced blackout regulations and maintained order in a chaotic time. This position of power was the perfect camouflage. It allowed him to move freely, to question strangers without raising suspicion, and most importantly, to gain the absolute trust of vulnerable individuals. Christie and his wife, Ethel, occupied the ground floor flat of 10 Rillington Place. The house was divided into several small, poorly lit apartments, with residents sharing a single outdoor washhouse and a small, neglected garden. The walls were thin, and privacy was a rare commodity. Yet, Christie used this incredibly confined space to conceal a systematic campaign of violence. His early victims were women marginalized by the war. In 1943, he encountered Ruth Fuerst, a young Austrian refugee. The following year, he targeted Muriel Eady, a colleague from a factory where he briefly worked. Christie's methodology was uniquely insidious and deeply calculated. He portrayed himself as a man of medical knowledge, offering treatments for various ailments. He exploited the era's reliance on domestic coal gas, creating a crude, modified apparatus. He would convince his victims to inhale a mixture he claimed was medicinal, often disguised with the scent of friar's balsam. In reality, he was administering a lethal dose of carbon monoxide. Once the victims were rendered unconscious and incapacitated by the gas, they succumbed to fatal asphyxiation. The clinical detachment with which he operated allowed him to seamlessly transition back to his daily life. He concealed the remains of Ruth and Muriel in the small communal garden, burying them mere feet from where his neighbors walked and washed their clothes. The community remained entirely oblivious, trusting the quiet former policeman who meticulously tended to his flower beds. While the soil of the garden held its grim secrets, the relentless demand for housing in London continued unabated. It was this desperate need for shelter that brought a young family to the doorstep of Rillington Place in 1948, setting the stage for a monumental tragedy. Timothy Evans, a 24-year-old van driver, and his pregnant wife, Beryl, moved into the top-floor flat. Timothy was a man who struggled with a severe learning disability. He could not read or write, possessed a low intelligence quotient, and had a lifelong habit of telling grandiose falsehoods to compensate for his deep-seated insecurities. Beryl was fiercely independent, but overwhelmed by the economic realities of their life. Shortly after moving in, they welcomed a daughter, Geraldine. The Evans family was trapped in a cycle of poverty and domestic strife, exacerbated by the claustrophobic conditions of the house. When Beryl discovered she was pregnant for a second time in 1949, the couple was thrown into a panic. They could barely afford to feed Geraldine, and another child seemed like an insurmountable burden. Abortion was illegal and highly dangerous at the time, but the desperation of their situation made them vulnerable to anyone offering a solution. John Christie, ever observant and opportunistic, recognized this vulnerability. He approached the couple, falsely claiming to have extensive medical training and offering to terminate the pregnancy safely. What transpired next in the shadowed confines of 10 Rillington Place remains a focal point of legal and historical analysis. Beryl Evans and the infant Geraldine disappeared. Timothy Evans, deeply confused, easily manipulated, and entirely reliant on the guidance of others, was instructed by Christie to leave London. Christie convinced Evans that the procedure had gone tragically wrong, that Beryl had passed away, and that he would arrange for the baby to be cared for by a couple in another town. Evans, paralyzed by fear and unable to process the gravity of the situation, fled to his relatives in Wales. Weeks later, entirely consumed by anxiety and guilt over abandoning his family, Timothy Evans walked into a police station in Merthyr Tydfil. His statements to the police were a chaotic tapestry of confusion and coercion. He initially claimed he had disposed of his wife's body in a local drain after she died from a concoction she took to end her pregnancy. When London police searched the drain and found nothing, Evans changed his story, finally pointing the finger at John Christie, stating that Christie had offered to perform the procedure and was responsible for Beryl's death. The police descended upon 10 Rillington Place. In a tragic oversight that would haunt the British police force for decades, the initial search was woefully inadequate. The officers examined the property, but failed to probe the garden where Christie's first victims lay, and they initially missed the washhouse entirely. It was only on a subsequent search that the authorities made a horrific discovery. Hidden behind a pile of timber in the communal washhouse were the remains of Beryl Evans and the infant Geraldine. Both had succumbed to asphyxiation. When informed of his daughter's death, Timothy Evans was completely broken. Under intense interrogation, without the presence of legal counsel, and deeply intimidated by the authoritative environment, Evans provided a confession that contradicted the physical evidence and his own previous statements. He confessed to the crimes. Psychologists and legal scholars who have since analyzed the transcripts point to clear signs of a false confession. Evans was highly suggestible, eager to please authority figures, and in a state of profound shock. The trial of Timothy Evans in 1950 was a swift and devastating miscarriage of justice. The prosecution painted Evans as a violent, deceitful husband. The star witness for the prosecution was none other than John Christie. Christie took the stand, presenting himself as a respectable, upstanding citizen, a former police officer, and an innocent bystander to the tragedy upstairs. He calmly denied any involvement in the deaths or any offer to perform an illegal medical procedure. The jury, swayed by Christie's articulate and composed demeanor, and prejudiced by Evans's erratic testimony and limited intellect, found Timothy Evans guilty. Despite his final, desperate pleas of innocence and his persistent claims that Christie was the true perpetrator, Timothy Evans was executed by hanging in March of 1950. With Evans dead and the police investigation closed, John Christie was left with a horrifying sense of invincibility. The justice system had not only failed to detect his crimes, but had actively protected him by executing an innocent man in his stead. Over the next 3 years, the darkness within 10 Rillington Place deepened. Christie's marriage to Ethel deteriorated. In December 1952, Ethel Christie vanished. Christie calmly informed neighbors and relatives that she had moved away due to illness. In reality, she had become his next victim, her remains hidden beneath the floorboards of the front room. Unshackled from any familial oversight, Christie's behavior escalated rapidly. Between January and March of 1953, he lured 3 more women to the house. Rita Nelson, Kathleen Maloney, and Hectorina McLennan were all individuals facing severe hardships, looking for shelter or assistance. Christie employed his established methodology, utilizing domestic gas to incapacitate them before ending their lives. By this time, the house had fallen into severe disrepair. The smell of decay was masked by heavy use of disinfectant, and Christie's mental state was deteriorating into paranoia and destitution. Having quit his job and exhausted his funds, he fraudulently sublet his flat and fled the property in March 1953, wandering the streets of London as a vagrant. The unmasking of John Christie began with a mundane domestic task. The landlord, unaware of the true nature of his former tenant, allowed a new resident named Beresford Brown to utilize the kitchen of the ground-floor flat. Brown wanted to install a bracket for a radio. As he tapped the wall to find a solid fixing point, he noticed a section of the wallpaper sounded distinctly hollow. Peeling back the paper, he discovered a hidden alcove. Shining a flashlight into the dark void, he saw a horrifying sight. He immediately contacted the authorities. The arrival of the police at 10 Rillington Place marked the beginning of one of the most meticulous and groundbreaking forensic investigations of the 20th century. When the authorities dismantled the kitchen alcove, they discovered the remains of the 3 final victims. The entire property was immediately declared a major crime scene, and a systematic excavation began. They lifted the floorboards of the front room, discovering the remains of Ethel Christie. They turned their attention to the garden, meticulously sifting through the soil, and unearthed the skeletal remains of Ruth Forrest and Muriel Eady, the victims from a decade prior. The forensic pathology team was led by Dr. Francis Camps, a pioneer in the field of forensic medicine. The task before Dr. Camps and his team was monumental. They had to establish the identities of the victims, determine the exact cause of death, and create a definitive timeline that would hold up in a court of law. In the 1950s, without the benefit of modern DNA profiling, forensic science relied heavily on detailed anatomical knowledge, odontology, and toxicology. Dr. Camps utilized dental records to positively identify several of the victims, a process that required exhaustive cross-referencing with local dental clinics. The most crucial breakthrough, however, came from the toxicological analysis. The forensic team examined tissue samples and, remarkably, the bone marrow of the older victims. They were searching for the presence of carboxyhemoglobin, a compound formed in the blood when carbon monoxide is inhaled. The tests returned positive. This scientific revelation was paramount. It proved that the victims had been incapacitated by gas prior to their deaths. This specific, highly unusual methodology was the undeniable signature of the perpetrator. It linked the recent discoveries in the alcove directly to the older remains in the garden, establishing a clear, continuous pattern of predatory behavior. While the scientists worked in the laboratory, a massive manhunt was underway across London. The public was terrified, and the press sensationalized the horrors of the House of Secrets. John Christie, meanwhile, was sleeping in parks and wandering the streets, a shadow of the authoritative figure he once projected. His capture was entirely unceremonious. On the morning of March 31st, 1953, a police officer patrolling near Putney Bridge noticed a disheveled man staring blankly into the River Thames. The officer asked for his identity. Christie, exhausted and with nowhere left to run, surrendered without resistance. The interrogation of John Christie was a masterclass in psychological obfuscation. He initially admitted to the murders of the women found in the alcove and his wife, but he was incredibly evasive regarding the deaths of Beryl and Geraldine Evans. As the questioning continued, the sheer weight of the evidence forced him to concede. He eventually admitted to the murder of Beryl Evans, though he stubbornly denied harming the infant Geraldine, perhaps clinging to a final, twisted shred of self-preservation. His admission regarding Beryl sent shockwaves through the legal establishment. It was the ultimate confirmation that an innocent man had been sent to the gallows just 3 years prior. The trial of John Christie commenced at the Old Bailey in June 1953. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere thick with public outrage and morbid fascination. Christie's defense team did not deny that he had committed the acts. Given the overwhelming forensic evidence, the detailed toxicological reports, and his own confessions, a denial would have been futile. Instead, they pursued a defense of insanity. They argued that Christie suffered from a severe defect of reason, a psychological compulsion that rendered him unable to understand the nature of his actions, or that they were wrong. The prosecution dismantled this defense with surgical precision. They utilized the forensic timeline established by Dr. Camps to demonstrate profound premeditation. They pointed to the construction of the hidden alcove, the modification of the gas pipes, the careful burial of the bodies, and the elaborate lies told to neighbors and the police. These were not the actions of a man disconnected from reality. They were the calculated maneuvers of a deeply rational, albeit highly dangerous, individual who understood exactly what he was doing and went to extraordinary lengths to avoid detection. The jury deliberated for less than an hour and a half before returning a verdict of guilty. John Christie was sentenced to death. In a stark reflection of the era's swift judicial processes, Christie's execution was carried out a mere 3 weeks after his conviction. He was hanged by the renowned executioner Albert Pierrepoint at Pentonville Prison, the very same facility where Timothy Evans had met his tragic end. But the death of John Christie was not the end of the story. It was merely the catalyst for a much larger reckoning. The realization that Timothy Evans had been wrongfully executed triggered a profound crisis of conscience within the British public and the legal system. The case of 10 Rillington Place shattered the absolute faith that society placed in the infallibility of the courts and the police. It highlighted the immense dangers of capital punishment, demonstrating with horrific clarity that once a life is taken by the state, an error can never be rectified. For over a decade, journalists, legal reformers, and the family of Timothy Evans campaigned tirelessly to clear his name. They faced immense resistance from a legal establishment unwilling to admit such a catastrophic failure. Finally, in 1965, an official inquiry was launched, led by High Court Judge Sir Daniel Brabham. The Brabham Report was a complex and heavily debated document. It concluded that it was highly probable that John Christie had murdered Beryl Evans, but, controversially, suggested that Evans might have been responsible for the death of his daughter, Geraldine. Despite this ambiguous conclusion regarding the infant, the sheer weight of doubt regarding his guilt for the murder of his wife was enough to force action. In 1966, acknowledging the unsafe nature of the conviction, the Home Secretary recommended a royal pardon for Timothy Evans. It was a posthumous victory, a small measure of restored dignity for a man who had been crushed by the very system designed to protect him. More importantly, the tragedy of Timothy Evans became a cornerstone argument in the parliamentary debates regarding the death penalty. The absolute horror of hanging an innocent man resonated deeply with lawmakers and the public alike. The case was instrumental in the passage of the Murder Abolition of Death Penalty Act in 1965, which suspended and eventually permanently abolished capital punishment for murder in the United Kingdom. The physical legacy of the crimes was eventually erased. 10 Rillington Place, along with the rest of the street, became a site of dark tourism and immense local distress. To combat this, the street was renamed, and ultimately, the entire terrace was demolished in the 1970s to make way for the Westway overpass. Today, there is no physical trace of the house where John Christie committed his atrocities. The story of 10 Rillington Place is a multi-layered narrative of deception, vulnerability, and the pursuit of truth. It forces us to examine the nature of trust, how easily we can be deceived by a uniform, a soft voice, and a facade of respectability. It highlights the vital importance of rigorous, unbiased forensic science in the pursuit of justice, showing how the silent testimony of bone and tissue can eventually speak louder than the most elaborate lies. But above all, it stands as a permanent memorial to Timothy Evans, Beryl Evans, Geraldine Evans, Ruth Fewhurst, Muriel Eady, Ethel Christie, Rita Nelson, Kathleen Maloney, and Hectorina McLennan. It is a stark reminder of the devastating consequences when the justice system fails the most vulnerable members of society. As we look back at the fog-bound streets of 1950s, London and the quiet, unassuming predator who walked among them, we are left to ponder a crucial question. In our modern era of advanced technology and sophisticated profiling, have we truly learned to see behind the mask of sanity? Or are there still shadows in our communities where the most dangerous threats hide in plain sight?